Thank you for that introduction. Hi, I'm Brian Carlson. I'm the Operational Excellence Lead for the Well-Architected program. In my role, I spend a lot of time analyzing what works for our customers and what helps them be more successful in operations. And that's why I'm here today to talk about building and implementing a robust monitoring strategy. So let's dive in. All right, why are we here? This is not a deep philosophical question, really. There are things we do in operations where we try and gain insight to what's going on in our organizations, because in operations, as in development, we're here to help achieve business outcomes. So by getting insight to that, we can ensure that those business outcomes can be achieved. We want to have our situational awareness to understand what's going on in our environment in case responses are necessary. And we want to be able to be proactive. So with greater awareness, we can get ahead of events before they can actually impact us, or we can minimize the impact of events on our customers. All right, and we also want to have those responses be both timely and effective. And we can measure for that if we have an effective monitoring strategy. And above all else, we're trying to achieve business outcomes. So let's take a look at that. Why do you need a monitoring strategy? Okay, these are kind of cliche. Failing to plan is planning to fail. And if you're a fan of ITIL, you'll certainly recognize that you cannot manage what you do not measure. So let's consider that. A monitoring plan is going to define what is measured. We're going to figure out how to approach measurement and how to approach what to measure in order to make sure that our businesses can achieve their outcomes. So let's start with that. Have you ever been asked how you're supposed to monitor in the cloud? Serverless workloads? Struggled with knowing why your workload had an issue? These questions get a little bit more intense as we go down the list, but really what I want you to realize here is that if you're in the screen space, you're in the right time to actually be acting and taking an effort around your monitoring planning. If you're down here in the red, you definitely need to have an intervention. If you're trying to figure out which monitoring tool is better, that's a bad starting point. You need to understand what to monitor for first. So let's go into that. All right, what is a monitoring strategy? How do you build one? You're probably familiar with the information cycle. Data leads to information. By applying context with that information, we can derive knowledge. Ideally, through that knowledge, with more context and more information about how it impacts, we gain insights, and that insight lets us lead to action. So what we're trying to do is set up a situation where our data informs us so that we can take action on that and intervene when events call for it. So what goes into that? Well, there's multiple things to be considered here. I am often asked, is 85% CPU okay? And I often answer, I don't know, is 85% okay? Because the heart of that is that if you're doing transcoding, you want your CPU as highly utilized as possible, but if you're running a cache server, it should be minimal. So what we need is the context for what does good look like? And that comes from people. We need to be able to trace back to a business outcome as defined by our business leaders. And then again, within the applications and workloads we're operating, we need to understand what healthy looks like. And that's going to involve the developers. So we have this three-way partnership between the business, the developers, and operations to elevate the business itself. Now, it's possible to do that with two or just one of those teams working on it, but it's a way huger balancing act. So I like to refer to this as the three-legged stool. Next up, we have system architecture information. That's what's providing part of our context for us. We need to understand the components, how they contribute to achieving our business outcomes. We need to have telemetry, something that when I talk to pure operations people, they love it, the fact that I point out that telemetry comes from both the workload and the application. And it really is the responsibility of the application developers to ensure their application emits the telemetry necessary to understand what is going on inside of it and what its health is. Now, operations teams are there to help them understand how that information is used and to help them dial in on what information is necessary to be successful with that. Now, with that information, we can definitely glean some insights and turn that directly into action. So when we're considering our approach, we have to consider the people, the architecture, our sources of telemetry, what insights we need, and then how can we turn that into action? All right, so let's talk about categories of insight. If you're like me, you're probably a huge fan of the ISO standard of network monitoring. I'm guessing there's not a lot of show of hands in the chat right now, but let's walk through it. We have faults. Of course, we want to know when something goes wrong, right? Error states. We want to track configuration. Known good states are important in ensuring we're actually operating what we think we are. Accounting, which is the attribution of utilization to so that we can actually charge back if necessary, or at least understand where our resources are being consumed. We have performance. which is often very similar to false, because if it is not performing, then it might as well not be available. And then finally, security. So this is the ISO standard, FCAPS, the acronym for it. Faults, configuration, accounting, performance, and security. But that's not enough. Each of those individual contexts don't let us understand the health of the workload or the achievement of business outcomes. And that's why we have to focus on outcomes. We need to be able to turn that information into an understanding of whether or not we're achieving what the business is going for. So we have to start there. Now, when we're achieving outcomes, we're in good shape. We can track what's going on, we can understand, and we can intervene as necessary. When we go beyond that, we start hitting space where we understand our user behavior and we understand our workload behavior. And with this information, it is far easier to spot anomalies and let us get ahead of events rather than responding to them. So FCAPS is a great starting point for any conversation. It makes it easier for us to categorize where we're looking at things and what the impact could be, but we have to sum it up to outcomes, and we have to understand user and workload behavior in the long run to get the most out of our monitoring. So with this strategy in mind, we're going to inevitably take this and turn it into an actionable plan. All right, so what do we have here? What we're looking at right here is a little bit of operational excellence. Let me just build this in really quick. So the operational excellence pillar is all about operations and supporting operations to achieve business outcomes and to refine your operations over time. And we break it down into 3 focus areas, or 3 sort of stages, and that's prepare, operate, and evolve. Now, looking at monitoring across this, in the prepare phase, we really want to understand what are the business outcomes we're trying to achieve, and we got to turn that into something that we can calculate or measure against. So what are the key performance indicators that are letting us know that a business outcome is being achieved? So start with the business outcome, go to the KPI, and then how can we turn that into a metric? And once we have metrics that are measurements to allow us to understand the achievement of KPIs and business outcomes, we can go into operations and act on that. So that pulls us into monitoring, which gives us the context and the response. And there we are with the response at the end. Now, that response is just not the momentary action when something goes wrong. That's not just the trending analysis against reporting. That's also taking action to avert future issues. So if we understand an event that can go wrong, why can't we go back and create a response to it so that we can avert it before it impacts our organization? You may have been in an organization where there was a bug that was not fixed because there was a focus on delivering new feature set. In cases like these, operations can compensate for that risk or that issue by automating responses. So one of the things we're going to talk about a lot is, what is the time frame for that response? What is the criticality behind that? Are you going to wake up at 3 a.m. to fix it immediately? Are you going to do it after lunch? Are you going to work on it all day and then come back to it in the morning? So you have to make a decision, an informed decision, about what the criticality is for your responses and then take an appropriate amount of action. But that's an ongoing conversation, and we'll get to that in more detail. All right, time for a quick poll. Do you have a monitoring strategy? 3 easy answers. Yes, it is a work in progress, and not yet. So let's take a moment and do that poll. I love the answer, it's a work in progress. Well, while you continue to answer, I'm going to step ahead. All right. What are some AWS services that support observability? I want to make a differentiation here. Observability is focusing on whether or not you can interrogate the data in your environment to ask not necessarily well-formed questions and understand what's going on underneath. Really, it's about how can you access all this data you're collecting, and are you collecting enough data to be able to ask those questions? But for today, we're going to be focusing on specific scenarios. So observability, we really have 2 things going on. We have Amazon CloudWatch and the related services around it. That includes things like metrics, logs, events, etc., right? And we also have X-Ray, which allows us to have traces in our environment. That is, following the execution of a transaction across components and application layer and understand what's going on. In the case of X-ray and traces, typically they're sampled, so you don't do it for every single event. but it gives you a strong indication of what's going on and an easier way to identify if there's a hotspot in your code, something that's taking longer than expected, or if there is a component that's having an issue and its behavior has changed. It's another opportunity to understand the behavior of your workload and then understand those anomalies when they emerge. Within tools like CloudWatch and CloudTrail, but specifically CloudWatch today, we're focusing on the events that are coming from our systems, our applications, the ones that are coming from our infrastructure components that we can look at in this single centralized interface and then take action against that. And later on today, we're going to go through a lab and we're going to review a way to take an application where we have a known issue that the developers don't have time right now to get to, and we're going to turn it into a self-healing scenario where it automatically fixes itself. And I know my preference is I'd rather get an email in the morning saying that the system fixed itself at 3 a.m. than be woken up at 3 a.m. to then try and respond. So I like this scenario much better. All right, let's continue into building a monitoring plan. So I did mention the fact that I'm often asked, is 85% CPU utilization okay? And the second thing I typically say is, you're starting from the wrong point. So we have a lot of information in the environment, but who's going to use it and how are they going to use it? Who's going to take action on it? Who has responsibility for it? We're going to walk through that. So my recommendation when you're building a monitoring plan, we've taken your strategy for how you're going to approach the problem. We're going to put this into an action plan. Let's start out with identifying our personas and their needs. Who are the people who are going to consume this information? So in any large organization, you might have a CEO who's probably interested in things like funding and costs, a CIO who might be really concerned about service delivery and making sure that the product is available for your customers. There might be someone like an infrastructure or an application person who wants to understand things. What is your customer experience? How can you tell? Because ultimately, if the customer believes it isn't good, it isn't good. So how do you measure for customer satisfaction as you're going through your application and playing out your telemetry? So start out with defining your personas and their individual needs. Write these things down. A simple spreadsheet is a great starting point. We're going to use these personas and needs and turn that into key performance indicators. Now, populating this in, we're going to take, for each of these key performance indicators we're trying to define, there's going to be an underpinning business outcome we're looking for. In the case of this sample, we're looking specifically at quality customer experiences. So then we're defining a KPI around that, a key performance indicator. And we're going to quantify that. Then we're turning that into a desired outcome. What do we want from that KPI? So in this first case, we want to have effective support response times. And our desired outcome is a response within 8 hours. Now, it's all well and good to establish a KPI, but sometimes they need to be revised. So make sure this is an iterative cycle. I'm saying that I do not believe that an 8-hour response time from a ticket is necessarily the right choice. However, a response in less than 8 hours is what the goal is. That's what good looks like. And that's going to be one of the big questions today. What does good look like? Because if we don't know what good looks like, we cannot tell if we're being successful. So what are we going to do? What's our time to action if a KPI is at risk? This is going to inform the criticality of something. So are you going to intervene at 4 hours in an 8-hour window of time? Is that when you're going to take action? Is that when you're going to escalate? Or are you going to wake someone up at 3 a.m., right? So if we have the case that a page load has gone beyond 15 seconds, we're going to take an immediate action. We're going to raise an event. So it's another thing we're going to talk about a little bit more here. Some things are escalations to human beings to take action, but where possible, we want to take a human being out of the scenario. We want to recognize the event by codifying it, recognizing it, and turning it into automated action where possible. All right, so actions taken, desired outcomes, how we'll measure, what does good look like, and a big part of the conversation is what is the time frame for action and what action will be taken. It's going to come up again. All right, so we know we have KPIs. How are we going to find information that can somehow quantify this? This is going to be an assessment. This is going to be an effort, a review. We're going to be going through and analyzing what are the available information resources. In this case, we got a bunch of lists for this workload we're calling Imagetrends. There's application server content, there's application content, there's network content, there's other parts of the infrastructure. I know there's a database on the back end. We need to understand what components are participating in the workload. What set of components are contributing to business value? We want to understand that interdependency as much as possible And then we want to understand where we can get information from that. Where can we draw insight? Now, we've talked about FCAPs previously and the need to understand outcomes and the need to understand behavior. Right here, we're trying to capture what insight we're looking for or what insight can be yielded by each of these pieces of information. We want to pick out what's really important and turn it into action. So we have some logs, we have some standardized metrics. When we first built this lab, I didn't know where the application logs were. I had a huge issue with it. And so I went to the developer of the application. I said, where are the logs? Assuming that there were some. It's a conversation that has to be had between operations and development people or DevOps teams working together. You have to identify the sources of information. If a piece of information that's not expected, that is expected, is not present, then you need to follow up and see what can be done to have it omitted. How can we get that out of the workload? So in this case, they were already there, and I got the information and I added to this. Now, this is a really valuable set of content. This is a really valuable set of information. Right here, we have the information necessary when some unknown event happens to figure out, well, where can we drill down into? If this is collected, if it's not collected, we know we have these avenues that we can pursue. All right. I'm going to highlight CPU, memory, disk I/O, and network I/O, sometimes referred to as the golden metrics. However, they have no value if you have no context. Unless you know what good looks like, you can't set a threshold to evaluate against. So don't focus on these metrics. Focus on the metrics that will contribute to your understanding of whether or not you're achieving those KPIs, those business outcomes. Is your customer having a good experience? If the response time for a page is 30 seconds, they're going to go somewhere else. So make sure you're meeting those timelines. All right, continuing on. Thresholds for testing. This is where we're going to take those KPIs, we're going to turn them into metrics, we're going to take what good looks like, we're going to turn that to a value, and then we're going to figure out the source of that information. This is basically our search for how we're going to define a metric. And in the lab, we're going to do exactly that. So let's look at some of these. If our system doesn't boot, are we going to take action? Absolutely, right? If we have a lack of availability, we need to respond right away. If our CPU is at an extremely high value, in this scenario, is the CPU at 100 as our test. Anything less than that, and we're okay with it. Now, if it's at 100% for 15 minutes, we're going to intervene. All right, so how do you know what a good threshold is? It's perfectly okay to just choose a value and then see what the feedback is and then iterate. In fact, that is the best practice. If you can identify based on your testing what the threshold should be, even better. But keep iterating on this and tuning this. Now, when we talk about thresholds, I want you to mentally picture a graph with a lot of little wiggly lines on it, all right? If we're on a scale of 1 to 100 and most of our movement in the line is between 1 and 5, that information is obscured in the graph because it's so fine, right? We can see things that shoot up to 20% and recognize there's an intervention that probably needs to happen. But if you are running at those low values all the time, change your value of examination so that those peaks and valleys are much more visible. Make your scale 0 to 20 so that you can recognize when there might be a significant event inside that pattern. So baselines are excellent, but perhaps there's an action that you can intervene against inside of there somewhere. So change your scale, change your thresholds, tune in to make sure you're getting the best possible result. All right. One of the most significant things I want to highlight here is that if we upload an image and there's an error, we definitely want to act on that. And that's going to come up in the lab. All right. So let's talk about time horizons. We're collecting data. We want to take action on that data. There's really 2 time horizons. Are we going to do it eventually, or are we going to do it real soon? And if it's eventually, we're generally talking about reporting. So in this scenario, we're going to look at those personas, the subscribers to the information. Who are the consumers, and is their need satisfied? We're going to do it by topics, cost and usage reports. That's something you can get directly out of your account, that information. If we combine that with our accounting information, we can do cost attribution. These are things that may be important. But when are you going to intervene on cost? It's a good question. If your costs suddenly skyrocket, do you need to intervene? It could be the case that your utilization has just gone way up, and this is actually great news. If the cost is matching the increase in revenue or the increase in utilization, then that's great. Not an issue. But if your budget in, say, the development environment is trending towards exceeding budget, then you probably want to intervene, and probably sooner than later. The development environment is not necessarily delivering customer value, but it does deliver business value. Is there scaling that can be done? Is there management that can happen there? Or are your expectations, do they need to be revised? So reporting is all about time horizon. When are we going to act on it? Is it going to be a week, a month, every quarter? Now, some of this trend information is actually really important. Some of this trend information, if it indicates a failure is imminent, can be turned into an alert. So that's the bridge between reporting and alerting. Now, I'm not saying that reporting isn't important. That compliance report to justify and explain and demonstrate your compliance with a legal requirement is extremely critical. So perhaps the time horizon for that reporting is most important when the reporting period is coming up. If you have to prove your compliance, compliance is really important and the time frame may be compressed. Just consider the way the information is used. All right, stepping forward. Alerts and actions. All right. Here's really where most of our intervention starts happening. We have a component, we have an area we're focusing on, we have a criticality that we've agreed to. Now that criticality, really, if you want the easiest test, am I gonna get up in the morning to fix this? Am I gonna stay at work until it's fixed? That's critical, right? High, I'm not gonna go to lunch until this is done, or maybe I'll do it right after lunch. That's a discussion in your own organization. Medium, I'll get to it when I do. Is that the right course of action? Let's take a look at some of these events. The first one, we have more than 0 image errors. Well, we know that image errors can actually cause harm in our application and even make it unavailable. So we're going to take action immediately on that. For something like investigating a warning, if you get two user authentication errors, does that deserve a warning or an action? Maybe not. That's a conversation with your security team. However, if you get 30,000 user authorization failures in 2 minutes, that definitely merits additional focus, and probably right away. That does sound like something's gone horribly awry, or someone's doing something malicious. So you have to have conversations around each of these. Now, the important things with alerting I want to highlight is every alert should have a process that will be executed against it. If you don't have a process that's going to be executed against it, why are you alerting on it, right? When we create alerts, they fill up our screens. If we're not going to act on them, why are they there? So every alert needs to have specifically an owner. And now in this case, we're highlighting roles. We're highlighting teams of responsibility. It could be an individual. Now that owner does not mean that that person always responds to that event, but it does mean they're responsible for defining the response and the escalation path beyond that. So ops is responsible for the process to delete that bad image when it emerges, whereas security is responsible for the process to respond to warnings. And the time frame depends, right? It may be the case that with a handful of authentication errors by one person, they'll talk to them, see if there's an issue. That's their investigation. It's a human intervention at that point in time. It's not the event-driven, we saw a bad image, now we're going to clean it up. So every process starts with an effective manual process before it gets automated, but it starts somewhere. But these are the considerations and these are the conversations. Now, we have a line here that says trending to exceed budget. We also have one that says we're going to investigate cause and prioritize our backlog is what actually lives behind that. So is that an alert? Well, prioritizing a backlog is going to happen on your sprint cycle. That is not an alert. That does not belong here. Trending to exceed budget, that's that conversation again. Are we going to cause harm to the organization? Are we going to make a comparison to see if our utilization and our revenue's gone up? There's a conversation, but limit where you can, because otherwise those alerts are just noise. All right. Let's, you know what? I'm going to backtrack through all this really quick and summarize. All right. Start with personas and requirements. People consume this information. Even if they turn it into automation later so that events can be managed, it starts with people. It starts with a need and a requirement. Start there. How will they use it? What will they do with it? All right. Turn that into key performance indicators. Make sure you're identifying an underlying business outcome that you're supporting. In this case, our goal is to support business outcomes. That's how we're successful. Developers produce applications and innovation to support the business. Operations supports the applications and supports the business to achieve those outcomes. We all work together to achieve that outcome. So, what are those outcomes? How can we quantify that as a key performance indicator? And what does good look like? And what is our time horizon for response? Look at your system architecture and determine where you can find information that can support your insights. Where can we find out information about the satisfaction of our KPIs? And remember, context is key here. Don't just choose a metric because it's an available one. Choose one that's contributing and make sure there's context to it so it's supporting your goal. Establish thresholds for testing. Turn those sources of information into metrics, determine the thresholds, and then alert on that as appropriate. Now, some of your data may be captured and put into reporting with that longer time horizon for response, and much of it will probably be put into alerts that lead to direct action. Remember, if you're going to alert, there should be a process behind it, and there should be someone who owns that process, even if someone else may execute it before it gets escalated up to that person inevitably. All right, let's continue. Time for a quick poll. Let's see here. We have 3 questions this time. Can you trace your metrics back to a KPI and a business outcome? Yes, no, working on it. Do you know what good looks like? Yes, no, working on it. Or do you have a process for every alert that you generate? Yes, no, working on it. I'm saying that there's a significant number of people who can't trace back to a KPI or a business outcome currently. And this may be the case that you just haven't had that conversation. But generally, you probably have feedback from customer space if something is wrong. So you're at least informing that information and you have a thread to pull to get that. But the real heart of that is to make sure that there's a conversation with the business team, because ultimately they own the risk for the organization. So they need to be part of that conversation. And they're the ones that say what good looks like. So I believe this is an ongoing effort continuously to see whether or not you still have the correct answer. So perpetually working on it is not a bad call. But for everyone that does know what good looks like, you're in an excellent position for starting. And a process for every alert you generate. Sometimes that process is call Brian. And you know what? That is an actual legitimate process. If you know the thing you do is you always escalate to your key engineers, that's the starting point. But if you have a single resource like that, it's better to have someone work with them to capture the processes they go through and the procedures they execute to recover. So take the time for that, generate that, because once you do that, once you've captured effectively, you can turn it into automation, hopefully, that will alleviate the stress on that key resource and also reduce the burden on the operations team. After all, the more we remove burden and toil from our efforts, the more we can work on elevating the organization. All right, let's keep going. Implementing monitoring. So we're going to look at our application called Imagetrends, and we're going to implement monitoring on it. Let's see where we start. Okay, so we have an application, lives in a VPC. We have a web application that tells you the attributes of your image. A picture is worth 1,000 words, and with Imagetrends, we give you a specific score. All right. We use Amazon Aurora as our backend database, and we track VPC flow logs to have information about what's going on in our environment. Next up, we pass our log information into CloudWatch. We use log groups to create focus areas where we can assess our data. And from those, we generate CloudWatch metrics. That's the metric that we're using to evaluate if we're achieving an outcome. With those metrics, we create alarms in CloudWatch alarms that we're going to turn into action. Sometimes that action is notifying someone, and sometimes that action is intervening. All right. So with those alarms specifically, we're sending a notification to an SNS topic. And that SNS topic also emails an owner so that they understand there's an impact to their workload. All right, let's talk about a best practice for a moment. You want to inform the people who are impacted when there's an impact on your workload or the resources they consume? There's an easy reason. They need to be able to take action if necessary. Their action might be just to wait and see, but we want them to understand what's going on so that they're not spending wasted cycles trying to figure out why there's an issue, right? So very much like AWS provides the personal health dashboard so you can understand what's going on in your environment. If there's something going on in the AWS environment, you need to communicate to your users and consumers when there's something going on in your environment so they can respond if necessary. All right, SNS topic is also another valuable thing. This allows us to fan out a notification to multiple subscribers. So in this case, we're emailing the owner, but we're also having Lambda pick up that information and turn it into an action. All right, so recap here. When that action is completed, we get the information back and it goes into Aurora. What the action actually is if someone uploads a bad image, application stops working. What's our response? It's to delete that bad image from our database and restore service. Now, the time for a human being to do this is much longer than an event that recognizes it and then takes action. And we're going to demonstrate that in the lab. So let's move right into that now. The lab. Okay, so by way of reference, this is the lab we're actually working on today. It's from our AWS Management Tools Immersion Day Labs. And I wrote this a while back. I can tell you that right now there are some changes in the console so it doesn't necessarily conform identically to what's there, but you'll certainly be able to figure out where everything easily enough. It's largely cosmetic changes. So there might be things in different locations, but they're all here. And there is a bit.ly link. Very nice. Thank you. All right, let's move into it. Oh, too far. Let me swap over to lab. One moment here. All right. Sorry that took a moment. Okay, where are we going to start out? Well, let's start out with a workload. In this case, we've used a CloudFormation script present in the lab to create a sample workload for our company called Example Corp. So looking over my shoulder here, you can see that this stack created a number of resources, including, let's see here, we have a CloudFormation stack. We have, we have a database, we have an ALB, we have an ASG, and we have our bucket where we're going to upload our content to in our application. We have monitoring for our CloudFormation stack, and we have our security groups defined, and we've defined our VPC. So specifically in this lab, we have you define an email address to send SNS notifications to, just like the diagram said before. And we have you define the security groups, or rather define the IP address from which you will be connecting to the lab so that only you can connect to the lab and other resources are exposed otherwise. All right, so from starting here, we've spun up our resource set, and now we're going to dive into it. So let's take a look at the application we actually have. Now, I spent some time populating it earlier. This is Example Corp, and here is our image application. And I've uploaded a whole lot of sample images, rather. And if we drill down into them, we can find out tags associated to them: pants, clothing, apparel. For things like this sphere right here, even though it's bent sideways, we're still recognizing the words on it: liquid nitrogen. We can tell there's architecture here. It's a sphere, possibly a dome. So we have reasonable details around it. So I'd add a few more images up to this right now. Let me just select some. Here's a poster I saw at JPL when I went on a tour. Stars Eat Planets. And we'll give that a moment, and it's going to come back and tell us what tags are associated to it. I'll grab another one. Person on a cell phone. All right. So within this application, we upload our images. Rekognition goes through and tries to detect what it can. I'll take a look at what I have so far. Here's that poster from JPL. It spotted the words. Very nice. It thinks there's a fish for some reason. I'm not quite sure, but there's certainly colorization like that. And it could be an advertisement, and that no doubt has the way to, it talks to the structure of the image. With our cell phone user, it's a person, human, face, lipstick, cosmetics, mouth, finger, teeth. All right. It also is detecting, it did not detect a specific camera, which is interesting. And one more. All right, road, building, camera, iPhone 6s Plus. This is a picture I took in Seattle a while back. Okay, so we have images. We've seen an application that does things, it applies tags, and we know it's working. Great. We want our users to have a great user experience. Well, let's think back to our personas. We have someone who's the application owner, and they're very concerned that our customers have a good experience. They have probably decided what accuracy rating is necessary to satisfy the customer. Obviously, goldfish is not what I expected for this planet and this star, right? I'm not really happy with that answer in the larger scale of things. I have an image that is certainly very confusing for automation to access, but perhaps there's something that we can do to refine the way in which we're doing the recognition activities. We want to let somebody know. So what are we going to do about that? Well, let's define a metric. First of all, the first thing I did around this application is I used Systems Manager run command to configure the client on it, the agent to pull the data. So what I have here in run command is I've accessed two commands specifically in my command history. I configured an AWS package. We can drill down and find out more about that, looking at the parameters in the command description. So what I did was I performed an install of the Amazon CloudWatch agent using the latest version. It's very easy. All I had to do was select it, choose which instances I was going to apply it to, and it did so. It was very easy. In fact, I can recreate that right away. So inside of run command, we have a lot of available commands. We can do a search for them. Oh, sorry. Run a command. All right. So we can configure an AWS package. When I select this, down below it opens up our parameter options. In this case, install, specify the agent, and specify the most recent one. When I do so, I can then choose my instances manually. There's only two running in my environment. My environment's very clean so that there's no debris in our conversation. Select them. No problem there. I can do rate control if I want to, and I could output everything to S3. In this case, I don't need to. And because I've already executed this, I'm not actually going to run it, but that's all that's required to install the agent. Now, the second thing I did was I configured the agent. I'm going to pull up parameter store. Now, if you've ever configured the agent manually, you know there's a script that you can execute on an instance, and you make your choices as you go through it, and it produces a JSON file. What we've done in this case is instead, we've actually put together that JSON file so that we can reference it as part of the install instead and use it consistently. So as a result, anytime a new instance comes up, we could do an event based on the emergence of the instance and then automatically configure the CloudWatch agent using this configuration. Do the install, configure the agent. In this case, it just specifies what logs we're using, what period for resources, what metrics we're going to generate. It's all the basic content. So we don't have to hit every single instance. We can just use automation to make our lives easier and do this for ephemeral resources that might spin up and then go away. So a nice event-based operations activity. All right, so with that configuration in place, where do we get to? Well, we start receiving logs. So what logs do we have in our environment? This environment's already configured to take VPC flow logs, so those are present. But we also have these logs that we define as part of our discovery, right? We have var log messages, we have a production log, we have our boot log, and we know what we might use that for. So if there's issues with booting, we'll go into boot log. But generally, our focus right now is to satisfy our application owner and make sure we can validate customer satisfaction by evaluating the confidence levels in what we're depicting. So I'm going to go into the application log and just take a look for a moment. I'm going to grab either of my log streams. All right. Now, these are all the logs that are coming in the environment. We have centralized our logging so that we have everything in one place so we can derive context from it. We can compare based on time signature when events happen together and do that correlation. In this case, I'm curious about confidence. So I'm going to do a search for CONF, knowing that it's going to yield confidence in the stream. And for some of these, confidence is extremely high, 99%. For some of them, not so high, 57%. I wonder if I do a search for goldfish, how confident it will be. Goldfish, 71%. That's probably actionable by our team, all right? Not exactly what I would have said was a goldfish. However, in this log, what we have is a bunch of information that we can parse out to turn this into a metric. And that's in fact our next step. All right, so we're gonna go from here. So we're gonna go back to our logs, and we have metric filters that are already defined. I have already baked this cake. All right, but let's take a look at it. So I have two that are present. One of them is this confidence level. And I want to point out this specifically. I'm going to grab that. What we see between the square brackets is a list of variables that we are naming the tokens inside of our log string. We're using space delimitation here. So log type is at the front, timestamp follows. And you can see that there's a confidence static value that says confidence plus a C value. All right. And then for this metric, we're dereferencing C value as our measurement. That's our starting point. So if we look inside of the application, inside of our definition here, there's our pattern filter. This is a test against our log data. Now, I see a challenge here. So I'm going to do a test of this pattern, taking the pattern we've defined and seeing the results we get. Let's show our test results. We did talk about the fact that everything doesn't work out the first time. In this case, the word confidence isn't present inside of our metric, but we're getting values in our $C value space. So it is possible we'll have to refine this later because that is not a confidence value and it might appear in our metric. All right, so with this defined, let's go to that metric. All right, here is my graph. Now, an important thing to be aware of, metrics don't appear in the past. So until you've defined a metric, you're not going to see the metric. And events that would have generated that metric in the past are not there. In this case, I need to change my time horizon for my application and my metric in order to find the content. Here we go. So you can see that earlier today, I was generating a bunch of logs. I was entering data over time, putting up those images, and we can see the confidence levels at different points in time. There's a C value of 5.96. That's not particularly good. But back here, we got something around 51%. That's pretty good. Right now, the value we're looking at is actually an average over 5 minutes. So is this indicative information? Is this useful? Is this actionable? Well, if we're looking at trends and we want to understand whether or not we're doing generally well or generally not, this might be okay. It might be more important to look at it in terms of minimums so that you can spot individual events where you want to take action. Now here we see 1 repeatedly, which is highlighting an issue we have. We know that the value of 1 is being grabbed by one of our rows when it shouldn't be. Our metric is grabbing 1 from a log entry that doesn't have a confidence variable in it. We'll come back to fix that at some point in time. Not today though. All right, so let's look at maximum values. This is far more interesting. Now we can see that where things are going well, how well are they going? If our maximum confidence is running at 16.3% or 20.7%, that's not very good. We can go back to that point in time, evaluate that specific image and try and address it. So what we have here is a reasonable way to understand what is our customer experience and are they being satisfied? And we can convert this into something like a dashboard in order to provide it to our consumer so they always have access to it. This ends up being reporting because the time horizon for action is based on their observation of it and when they decide to take action. And with confidence levels like this, we're not going to fix it in minutes. This is something that will have to be added to a sprint to be adjusted. All right, let's look at another use case. Going back to our logs, let's look at our second metric here. All right, in this case, it's our image error alarm. We know that if we get a bad image, it brings down the application. And in fact, we can demonstrate that. But the way we know it happens is by the presence of active storage, : and variable error. So when this occurs, we know we want to take action. Looking at more detail again, there's our file pattern. The quotes matter. We can test the pattern and see whether or not we get any results. Now, the fact that it says 0 matches out of 50 might just be because of where the sample is occurring. So that's not necessarily a concern. All right, so once we assign that metric, we can actually go forward and create an alarm around that. But let's take a look and let's watch it actually happen. So going back into our application, I'm going to upload an image I know won't work. Break app image. Turns out this break app image is actually just a Word doc that's been changed to be .jpg. In this case. So when I upload it, this page is not redirecting property. Well, it's not going to get better ever. It died right away. I'm having a bad customer experience. No doubt our CIO, who's really concerned about application availability, is also not happy right now. So what's my course of action? Well, it turns out I do have an administrative interface. And I can go over here to my administrative interface. I can review what's present in the environment. I can look at how each of these images were identified. Let me refresh that. And looking at it, debugging this active issue in our environment, I can see that there is an error that has come back on this specific message. All right, errors means it's a bad image. We need to do something about it. Okay, so it's good that I was right on top of this and that I recognized it happened right away. Of course, I was the cause of it, but at least now I can go through and I can delete this image and hopefully I can restore service. So going back to my application, is it back? And we're back. Okay, so why haven't the developers fixed this? Now we know it, we document it, we give the characteristics of it, we provide that to the development team to enable their response so they can be more effective and they can add this to the backlog, or they can do it as a break fix perhaps. Or perhaps they're working on features right now that are critical that might have a due date associated to a customer obligation. So let's compensate for it instead. They're not available to take care of it. Operations will do what's necessary to support this as effectively as possible. We don't want 3-minute outages, so what are we going to do? Well, we know we can recognize the event, so let's capture that event, generate an alarm, and let's codify our process for actually deleting that bad image out of our database. Okay, let's dive in there. Oops. Oh, I had built that alarm, and our alarm let us know what happened. So, as a person working at the workstation, I'm actively monitoring. I could have seen the alarm come up, and then I would be able to take action. But that adds the latency of both my attention and my ability to respond. So an alarm is not enough. But let's take a look at this alarm that we do have. Here's our image error alarm. Okay, so we have a graph of it having occurred with this predefined time window. We can know that we're currently in OK state, and we know it happened. The characteristics that we've defined for this alarm are, well, its name, it's an image error alarm. We've set a threshold, so greater than or equal to 1 for one data point over 10 seconds. What we're saying here is anything that isn't no message is bad. In fact, we call that out specifically. Treat missing data as good. It doesn't breach our threshold. So what we have here is really simple. For our metric, we've generated an alarm. If we see anything at all that isn't nothing, then we have a problem. Now, I can intervene or I can take action on this. We've also defined for this one that we will notify our SNS. So we will send this to the description list and everybody who subscribes to this will know. In fact, if I look at my email, I got an alarm. So I got notified. I could also send this to our impacted customers so they can do what they need to do. With an image application, not really a big deal. If this was a lack of availability of a system where you would be processing payments, perhaps they have a secondary process or a manual process they can execute instead. If they're trying to buy things, we can leave them a message saying, we currently have an outage. We understand this. We'll get back to you soon. I'll delete this message for now. We'll see another one appear, no doubt. All right, so we have an alarm. We're setting a notification. I subscribe to it. Let's set up a Lambda to also subscribe to it. All right, so we have our event. We have an alarm we created from it. If you want to see that interface, I can dive in here. We're choosing our metric. We're defining the criteria for it. Do we want a sum? We have our period. In this case, 10 seconds is what we actually used previously. What do we want to do when it happens? Well, in this case, it was greater than or equal to our threshold. Remember, threshold values are something you tune over time. You don't necessarily know that the value you're starting with is appropriate. In this case, it's very binary. So in that case, if it's 1, then we're going to do something. Now, if this is CPU utilization, it's something different. If this is disk I/O, it's something different. It's a choice to be made based on your analysis. So that's essentially what's involved in creating this. Then we could also set up our notifications, choose the SNS list we want to send it to, and we can assign a name and a description. But having that already in place, we don't have to do that. All right, let's look at our Lambda. So we have a Lambda function that we've set up to actually fix this. It goes in and it deletes the offending image. Relatively simple. It's exactly what the application interface enabled us to do. In this case, we're passing information about the image in the event so that we can delete the correct row. But the other thing I want to do is I want to complete the setup here so that this will be invoked. And for that, I have defined the VPC in which it is operating. So if you go down here, I have not committed this change yet. I have selected my VPC for Example Corp. And I know this is something that's going to happen inside the application space. So I've assigned my 2 application subnets. And the security group I'm using is the one that's appropriate for my application hosts. Now with that, I can save this change. And this will now be active inside my VPC. So what's going to happen the next time some malicious person uploads a bad image? Well, let's be that malicious person. I'm uploading my bad image and my page is not redirecting properly. It's 3 a.m. I've just been woken up by my pager. I'm groggy. I don't know what's wrong. My pager says application is down. What is my starting point for analysis? Happily, I have codified my process for doing this using playbooks, and I have procedures that I will execute when I identify what's wrong. Now in this case, I'm wondering did I configure it completely correctly? There's an easy way to find out. I will look at my images and see if it is in fact present. All right, let me check my configuration. I have Lambda. Oop. Here I'll set it 31 seconds. I have my VPC defined. No demonstration survives contact with an audience. I have selected both my application subnets. I have my security group assigned. I will redo that. I will save my change. And I will check my event. Let's test it. Oh, no. Now we can monitor this as well, happily, so we can see whether the event actually arrived. So, did I have a situation where I had eventual consistency and my Lambda had not yet become active? That's possible. It looks like an event did occur. Let's try and break things again. Oh, I have not committed my recovery. There we go. Now I've committed my recovery. And now I can check my application to see if it's back. It is. There you go. Everything starts with a manual process that works. Then you automate it, refine your automated procedures to make sure they're effective. Let's upload that bad image. All right, now I'm just going to jump right over and see what we can see. Going back to CloudWatch, we can see that we're in an alarm. That's great. We know that we have this notification for it. That's exactly what we expect to see. That's based on our log. Looking at our log and the application log, we can certainly look and find that error state. So we know that errors are happening. That's where our metric is generated from. That's what leads to the metric that generates the alarm. So here in our metrics, that's actually my confidence values. I want to go to my other metric. One moment. Oh, I went to the alarm. I want the metric. And here's my image error metric. So we can see when they're occurring. That's the same thing that we actually see over here in this graph for our image error alarm. You can see it occurring. Now, did Lambda capture it and take action on it? Let's refresh. And then I will, oh, it did. We have recovered. Excellent. Eventual consistency is a real thing. Interestingly enough, it is possible and frequently occurs that it may recover before we actually see it reported in the console. The console does have a minimal amount of latency. So you may discover that it has been recovered before it's displayed in the console. But very nice. So there we have it. Let's close the loop here. We have a situation where our application owner wants to ensure our customers are having a great experience. And so how do we do that? Well, we're doing it based on confidence levels. Oh, and I did get the alarm. I got my notification of failure. So we're looking at metrics. And the metrics that we have chosen are related to the quality of the confidence in the image. So we have metrics that tell us when something's broken, and that satisfies the requirement our CIO has about availability, and are we responding in an appropriate time frame. And we have metrics around the confidence levels to let us know the experience our customers are having. And we can tell if it's good or bad, and we can tune this in. We can create dashboards so it's always available. With the information we have, when we look at image errors, interesting correlation there. They happen on an upload. When we have the image errors, we create an event that leads to an alarm. That alarm creates a notification to SNS that the owner receives, our customers receive, that we can take action on. It goes into Lambda. Lambda recognizes it, and then Lambda takes action on it by performing the remediation activity that we define in our configuration. And what we effectively have is a self-healing application. When something goes wrong, an automated process repairs it. So our monitoring is effective. We've optimized our operations. We're also ensuring more reliability and availability, which also leads to customer satisfaction above and beyond the satisfaction that comes from the confidence of the image recognition. So there you have it, end-to-end from a consumer, a business outcome, a KPI, a metric we identify, a form of reporting over time through a dashboard, down to the alert that yields an immediate action by recognizing the event and turning it into an automated response for recovery. So from our strategy, through our plan, through to execution, and here we are. All right, so let's go back to the slide deck. All right, time for a quick poll. Now, I can't see the questions right now. Let me just grab that. Quick change. Questions are, oh yeah. Do you have any automated responses to events in your environment? Yes, no, working on it? Why is that displaying that way? Let me see if I can check out the responses that we're getting. All right, oh, I'm sharing my desktop. It's okay? All right. So something to consider if you're saying no or you're saying working on it. If you use autoscaling, you have an automated response based on load. You've defined a rule around the considerations of load on your systems, and you've turned that into autoscaling so that you scale out based on response. So you might not have thought of it that way, but autoscaling groups, load balancing, these are all mechanisms that are automated responses based on events in your environment. In those cases, the event is just specifically load on your systems. So give yourself credit for that and use it as a launching board to do even more. All right, with that said, back to the slides. All right, establishing metrics. That's where we started. We configured our logs so they could be centralized. We used a automation using Runbook. We had an automation document that allowed us to do the installation followed by the configuration. We set up filters aligned to business outcomes. We generated logs through user activity. I had to post the images in order to actually generate that activity, but we saw the responses from it. And we verified the metrics are working as designed. In fact, we verified that one of them wasn't, because a confidence level of 1 is background noise from an incorrect log. So we need to iterate on that. We can recognize it's there. Next up, alerts and notifications. Alerts should be tied to business outcomes. So in this case, when we have an outage, we respond. We only alarm when actions are required. Now, we did define two types, we only defined one type of alarm for action. Would we define alarm around confidence levels? Probably not, because it's very much dependent upon the image that's been put forth. So if it's a really good goldfish and it's a high confidence, or it's a bad goldfish and it's a low confidence, that's not something we're going to respond to immediately. And if we're not going to respond in a really short time frame, it's not an alert. Actions must be documented. We started with our manual process that was well understood. We went to our administrative interface. We executed the command to delete the offending log file. Sorry, not log file, image file. We had that runbook documented, and then we turned it into automated actions. Now, runbooks should be reviewed and updated. Let me clarify there, because I know I mentioned both runbooks and playbooks. Playbooks are the processes that you follow in order to determine a root cause or contributing factors. So it's the investigation you perform to find out what's wrong. Runbooks are a procedure with an expected outcome. So in this case, our procedure for analyzing the alarm is we went to the logs to determine what the error message was, and then we figured out what action was required. We needed to delete that offending image. Our runbook is the steps we go through that delete that image. When we do that, we expect the image to be deleted, and we expect service to be restored. So playbooks are processes, uncertain outcomes, and runbooks are procedures with specific outcomes expected. And if they don't work out, then there's a problem with your runbook or the environment you're executing in. Now, responding to events. Document known issues with your workloads. In this case, we know the developers don't have time to fix it. Everyone's aware of it. It's in the backlog. Determine the corrective actions. That's in our runbook. Build a runbook for the corrective action. We've already done that. And automate the corrective action and automate those runbooks. Make it that you don't have to get up at 3 a.m. I'm not a fan of it. I've had 2 pagers and 2 cell phones at the same time for different support reasons. And there's nothing better than checking your messages in the morning and finding out self-healing happened. All right. What have you learned? What should you do now? Well, create a plan. Recognize that there needs to be strategy around this, that you need to involve additional participants. This isn't all about operations. This is about operations having conversation with developers. This is about operations having conversation, operations and developers having conversations with the business team, because the business team is defining what success looks like. They own the risk, they own the liability. We all work for their benefit. We all work for the outcomes they're trying to achieve. Focus on understanding that business outcome first. Don't choose arbitrary metrics. Start with a business outcome, go to a KPI. Convert that KPI into a metric. Know what good looks like, make that your target. And if you're always succeeding, change your target so that it's more constrained. Make it harder for yourself so that you might identify things that would one day become an emergent condition. Walk through each of the steps. It is worth it. Make a spreadsheet. Choose the columns that make sense to you. But go through these activities and ensure that you can trace back, ensure you're satisfying the requirements that live behind you. It is possible there's someone in your organization that really could benefit from information you can provide to them. You may not know yet. Find out who your personas are. Figure out who they are, figure out what their roles are, figure out what their needs are. Your operational priorities and the development priorities are going to be driven by the business. But when those can rise up and be the priority, take advantage of that. And walk through it in its entirety. Look for your sources, determine what the time horizon is, create reports, dashboards, and determine alerts and responses. Understand your criticality and make sure there's an owner for every response. All right. Implement that plan. Gain insight. Ensure you can understand when business outcomes are at risk. And even environments like AWS and on the retail side, we check order rate. We have a great understanding of what order rate looks like over time. If it suddenly drops off, we know something's wrong. It may not be indicative of what went wrong, but it is an indication that something did go wrong. So you need to take action there. You can no doubt identify some characteristic of your environment that indicates that something is amiss. This goes back to understanding outcomes, even better, understanding the behaviors of both your users and your workload. And then finally, improve your mean time to detection and your mean time to recovery. The faster you know, the faster you can respond, especially if you're able to leverage automation. All right, let's have some Q&A. Shall we take questions? Let me pull up the question set I have. Thank you, appreciate that. All right, let's see if we have anything specific that's come up. Okay, I am not the same Brian who writes a PG Node library. Thank you for the question. Now I'm really curious to meet the other Brian Carlsons. Will the webinar be available for later review? Yes, it'll be going up on both Twitch and I think YouTube. Is that correct? Yep. All right. Yes, there is a recording. It will not be sent out later. If you provide us the feedback, then you get the information that way specifically. So that way it is sent to you. Will there be any demo of solution? Oh, I think I've already covered that. And check out the lab. You can go through all the steps yourself, get the exercise and develop the muscle memory. And hopefully it's an analogy that will allow you to apply it really to your environment. How to achieve feature delivery and operational excellence at the same time? That's an excellent question. Okay, that's one to chew on. So feature delivery, let's back up a step and talk about how customer satisfaction emerges, right? Features drive customer satisfaction, but so does availability. Doesn't matter how good your feature is, if they can't access it, there's no value delivered. So it's really important to understand that the requirements that do not contribute to feature set are still requirements. So you need to make sure that you're actually addressing those things as well. They have to have the same priority, because if there's no availability, there's no application, features do not exist. So how do you trade off? Well, it comes back to that question we talked about, who's going to do what and what the priorities are. In the case where developers are really working hard on velocity and getting features into production, operations can try and compensate for issues in the environment, such as we did today, by putting in place compensatory controls, things that will make up the distance and address issues when they emerge. That isn't long-term sustainable. Eventually it is inevitable that you have to come back around and you have to fix those issues that are in your environment. So how do you do both? You set priorities based on the priorities of the organization. What are the things that are actually weighing in on you and your organization right now? There are all kinds of good reasons to implement something that is not perfect. If your most important thing right now is that you need to drive revenue because capital is an issue, then you're going to make a different choice than if you're in a much more secure position and you want to ensure that security is emphasized over anything else. So those decisions really come back to your business owners, the owners of the application. Who is it that's driving that decision? So have the conversation with them. Find out what's important to them and then emphasize the resources there. You have finite resources. Ideally, you're going to do whatever is going to support your organization. If operations can relieve some of the burden, excellent. All right. If one is just starting, what is the most important? If one is just starting, what is the most important well-architected framework practices he or she needs to start with? You know, that's interesting. Where to start? Personally, if I was going to trying to dive into well-architected and I wanted to get the most information in the least time, I would look at the appendices in the well-architected framework document. It's the list of all the questions and the associated best practices. Now, that's if you want something portable. Otherwise, just diving into the console and looking at the tool, the advantage you get from the tool is that the tool also has links to supporting documentation that are maintained dynamically. And we're always adding content there. So if you want more information about a best practice, you can click on the info link and it directs you right over there. So diving into the tool is an excellent starting point to get information. Now, if you're talking about where you start in order to take your journey through delivering cloud-native applications, operational excellence is the first pillar and well-architected, not because it's the most important, but because it sets the groundwork for the decisions you're going to make in every other pillar. So start out with OE, and especially the first question OE, which is what are your priorities? Because just like that previous question, how do you balance delivery and operational excellence? That's a decision that's driven by your business. So look at that question, work with your teams, and determine what your priorities are. You have to understand your internal customer needs, your external customer needs. It's really critical to understand your legal compliance requirements. You have to understand your obligations. And then from there, what we want to get to is understanding your trade-offs and making informed decisions. But when you're doing that, balance benefits and risks. And the reason I emphasize benefits is because when we emphasize risks, everyone looks only at the risk scenario and they don't consider the effective weight. If you're focused just on risk, you're going to miss out on what might be a huge benefit. So look at benefits and risks and make that informed decision. After that, I really believe that security and reliability are critical. Which one's more important? I can't say. However, if you're not secure, you have no customer trust. Without customer trust, then you don't have a business. Without reliability, you have no availability. Your application isn't there. You have no business. So start with operational excellence. Look at priorities, figure out how you're going to evolve your organization. Then look at security and reliability. That's my recommendation. I don't want to diminish either performance or cost optimization. Cost optimization is often less of an emphasis until it's an emphasis. So if you're in a startup mode and you're working on just dynamic stuff and you're using lightweight things to test out ideas, cost is not a big impact. But like we talked about earlier, if your utilization is going up significantly and your budget's going up or your expected spend is going up, then you need to understand what the cause of that is. And that's where cost optimization comes in, and the best practices there can really support you. And of course, performance is very similar to fault detection. If your customer says it isn't good, it isn't good. And between performance and cost optimization, you can make the best choices around what services and features you leverage to achieve those outcomes. All right, let me see some more. Are we going to see any DevOps tools being used in this demonstration? Alas, no. Speaker screen is covering the slides. I'm sorry, I didn't see that earlier. Is Imagetrends also an AWS service? Imagetrends is actually based on recognition. It's just an application that was built by an internal SA to demonstrate a proof of concept for a customer. But you have access to it, and as I understand it, it's being open sourced, but you can use the CloudFormation, you can use it to your heart's content as a learning tool, so please do enjoy. Can you put the lab link in the chat? Can someone put the lab link in the chat for me, if that has not been done already? Oh, there's a highlight that bit.ly links are case sensitive. Very good. Should we be using our own AWS environment for this lab? Yes. I stress, though, that please do not do it in a production environment. We don't want anything to accidentally have an impact. In my case, I used a brand new fresh account that I created specifically because there's no impact from it. It's not associated with any of my production activities, so nice and safe. And I believe that if you leave it up for a very short period of time, most of it is all free tier, as far as I recall. But any cost associated to it is going to be extremely minimal. Just remember that when you're not using it, clean it up and remove it. We wouldn't want you to leave something in place and have an unexpected event. Although that said, if you're monitoring for cost, you'll be able to recognize that. All right. Oh, and there's a shout out to John Steele. Thanks for the last talk. Can you please remind me, one of the first slides in parallel to CloudWatch, there was another icon or service above it. That was X-Ray. So X-Ray is our distributed tracing service. You essentially embed calls to it inside your code, your application code specifically. It is service aware. So it will work with the services that you're associated to. You don't have to do any specific configuration there. And what it generates is a trace. So a trace is a visualization of the steps that your transaction goes through as it crosses your application. So in that regard, you can see the time it typically takes, and you can see what the current sample looks like. And it gives an indication of what the ratio is. So if something is in fact an anomaly, you can identify that. It does the same thing when calls are made from your application components to service components. So if you push a change and then suddenly you're seeing a significant delay in the time between the application and a database, it's possible that you've introduced something inside one of your queries that is much more costly, or perhaps not what you intended. So it's a great way to identify things like that in your environment. The other thing it does for you is it will actually map the movement of your transaction across all the components in your workload. So if you're running in a highly distributed environment with microservices, where you might not necessarily be able to tell where they're moving through the workload, this will give you a map of the relationships between those individual components. So it's an excellent opportunity there. You can implement distributed tracing in other methods for sure. You could be logging individual transactions and before and after calls, but this puts in place all of the visualization and everything else that will help you. Plus, it works natively with our services and features. Are the slides available for download now? Not yet. They will be in the next couple of days. That's part in the email that you will get back. And yes, use your own accounts, please, for the lab. We don't have anything available for you right now. Will the link to the lab still work next week? That's a permanent site. And there's other labs there as well. That's the Immersion Day site for management tools. So there's lots of things inside of here. We have System Manager, CloudWatch, Config, CloudFormation, Service Catalog, and even a lab on X-Ray. So feel free to check it out, take advantage of it. I believe the link we gave you is specifically to CloudWatch, but you'll see all the rest of this content right there when you look at the site. All right. Are participants able to send private message? Oh. Is the code for the lab application in a GitHub repo? Not currently. We have the well-architected lab site on GitHub, and inevitably all this content will end up there. Right now it's only available through the Immersion Day site. And once it's there, it is in fact open source. How to implement AI for monitoring logs. That is not a small conversation. I think there's an opportunity. You should come to one of our summits or events and have a conversation with some of the service teams around that. And I am in fact drinking iced tea. What else do we have? Can we put the full URL out for the site because it's blocked on some sites? On the idea of self-healing, is there any guidance on how you go about introducing it, or is it specific to your workload and use case? I'm looking for something at a higher level. So self-healing is enabled by some architectural choices. In the case of this application, they generally were not there. It was really the case of we recognized an error, and then we created an automated response to that. There's a conversation to be had about the way in which you work with an active workload. Having awareness of what's upstream and what's downstream from it can be very important, so you know what the impacts are if you actually are modifying some component of your workload. This is a really deep question, and I'm starting to think that perhaps this is a good opportunity for another session entirely, having a discussion about automation safety. I know that I am presenting an automation safety session at reInvent. It's going to be a chalk talk, and I will try my best to convert that into the next batch of presentations that we do through Well Architected. But your starting point is definitely working with the developers to understand the origin of the issue in the event, and then turning that into some form of manual process that you then turn into an automated process. The important things, though, are the developers must emit the telemetry necessary for you to recognize the event, and then you need to be able to grab that event and through your own automation, script the activities to remediate it. So when you make that pipeline of recognition to event recognition of the event to action to remediation, you've established self-healing. But we'll do something more about automation safety at a later date. Can logs external database be incorporated in the monitoring plan to have a complete view? Absolutely. So let's look at that in more than one way. First of all, I recommend using the systems that work for you, and as long as they satisfy your requirements. And that might be something like cost or some other feature set or capability. Use the tools that work for you. If you have logs external, you could certainly ingest them into CloudWatch and take advantage of their all in one central location. If that isn't viable for you, definitely include your sources of information and insight into your entire strategy. There is no reason why you would ever want to exclude something simply because it wasn't in a convenient location. It just means you're adding more mechanisms around sharing messages between locations in order to aggregate that up. So consider that as part of your strategy, but don't exclude anything. The question comes back to, can you get that telemetry to an actionable location? And whatever the tool is that allows you to take that action, great. Better to have it all together so that you can aggregate and have context from looking across all those sources. But if that's not viable in the short term, do what works in the short term, and then plan long term to improve your logging strategy. There's a question about third-party monitoring tools, and we have a lot of monitoring tools through our partner marketplace. Lots of them are very effective. They add additional features and capabilities on top of what AWS already offers. So it's definitely worth looking at those if you're looking for those feature sets above and beyond what we have for you today. But we're always improving as well. Lots of questions about the links. Can X-ray be used to debug issues with Lambda functions? The short answer is yes, right? X-ray does allow you insight into the request layer, so you can see what's going on there and you can see the movement of your transaction across it. Lambda is inherently transitory, but you have logs and events around the activities on its invocation, so you can use it to diagnose that as well. But definitely take a look at it holistically. X-ray will help you understand the path your transaction took, but the logs and metrics that come out of Lambda will give you context to the event in that sample. Okay, I really love this question. In the context of a small company, any advice on how involved developers should be in developing and implementing a monitoring strategy? Great question, as much as is practical. We all have our responsibilities. The developers really do have to emit the telemetry that's necessary, so they need to be involved. The bigger question I think behind that is, how separate are they? Generally in small organizations, everyone works in very tight quarters, so there's a lot of integration across teams that may just be coming naturally and organically because everyone's in the room and able to talk. So they have to be involved because the telemetry of the application is core to monitoring the application. The infrastructure and platform that's related, that may be the responsibility of your operations team or your platform engineering team, but they have to work together because without the complete context, you can't effectively operate it. And it goes back to, you can't have the availability you need for your customers if you don't have operational excellence, just like you can't have that availability if you have issues in your architecture. So look at it holistically, get everyone to participate. Now, how much should they be involved in defining metrics and doing the configuration? That's a conversation between you. But we need to understand what good looks like. And that's a conversation with the business owner. So follow that path. What does good look like from the perspective of the business? What's the underlying business outcome? What's the KPI? What can we use to generate a metric that supports the identification of that KPI and its achievement? And right there, the developer has to be involved. Taking action beyond that for the implementation, that could live entirely with the operations team. But on your iterative cycle that leads to your continuous improvement, they have to be involved. I highly encourage people to have ops metrics meetings where the business, the operations and development meet to talk about the metrics weekly or monthly, at least monthly, in order to say, are we meeting the outcomes? Is this delivering the value you expect? Are these metrics still valid? Are these KPIs still in use? We don't want to be maintaining things that are no longer valid. And at the same time, we want to identify if we have left something out or there's a new emerging condition that we need to address. If there's a significant change in your environment, it's probable that there's a significant change to the monitoring requirement. All right, there's a question about CloudTrail versus CloudWatch. CloudTrail is the API calls. They're definitely important, but for our example, we kept it a lot simpler. But CloudTrail gives you the opportunity to recognize the events that are firing off in your environment, those API calls, and that enables activity as well. There are scenarios around making sure something is tagged where when you see the creation, you can spin off an activity based on that recognition to automatically configure it. So like those ephemeral resources we talked about when we talked about configuring the agent, when a new instance is instantiated, when we can recognize that from CloudTrail, we can launch the processes to configure the agent, install the agent and apply our configuration. And that ephemeral resource is now under our management control. So we're good. And that took no intervention. Managing ephemeral resources is really the big difference in the cloud. We have to expect things to exist for a while and go away. And as much as possible, we want to remove that manual burden of doing those configurations. So use events to yield action, and then you'll get your outcomes. All right, I think we have 47 seconds left. I think that will be, I think it's our last question for today. Thank you so much for your time. It was an absolute pleasure to speak with you. And I hope you got some value out of today's conversation. Thanks.